Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to seminar number 2. I hope that you guys all have looked at the changes to the syllabus and you see that I lighten things up, especially because a lot of you guys are in research. And I want to make sure that we all get through this course and this semester successfully. So make sure you look at the changes to the syllabus for this course. And so today, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. What we're going to do is we're going to process a lot of the things from seminar number 1 so that we can discuss a lot of those issues. I want to make sure we follow up on those, and then we'll discuss, our next topic for the next seminar. And I warn you of a few things. A, I'm feeling a little sick, so you might see that I have a coughing fit in the middle of this. B, I'm at home and my children are supposed to be asleep, but that may or may not happen, so they may run in. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up my PowerPoint here. Let me make that small. There we go. So for the first part of this seminar is processing after the last seminar. So, I really want you to think about what thoughts you left with. I want you to be able to stop and think about maybe how your feelings or your thoughts about trauma and victims of PTSD may have changed. This is for discussion question number 1 for seminar 2, asks you to really think about those things. Think about that comparison in seminar 1 between victims of rape and soldiers of war. How do you feel about that comparison? Does that seem like a fair comparison? There has been some controversy about that. The majority of the controversy centers on the issue of choice. That's an issue I hear a lot, which is, soldiers, although what happens to them is awful. And, I have a brother, many of you know, who did 3 tours and has severe PTSD. So this is an issue very close to me. Soldiers do at least have a choice at some point in that process, right? So they can decide whether or not they want to join the military, whereas rape victims do not. There's never any choice. There's never any ability to opt out. So sometimes there's the feeling that that's an unfair comparison. But I think what's important is that I want you to understand a few things, is that trauma in a variety of different ways presents itself very similarly to people. So you'll have someone who, not only is a soldier of war or is a victim of rape, but somebody who has been in a severe car accident or, was in some sort of traumatic event, like a holdup at a grocery store or a convenience store, somebody who's had somebody very close to them murdered, those sorts of things. Trauma presents itself very similarly. And you want to be able to sort of identify when you're dealing with a client who's really suffering from some trauma. Because remember, as a BSW social worker, a lot of what you're going to be doing is providing referrals to services. So you want to really be able to understand all of the issues your clients are having and what referral services they might need. So being able to identify that, hey, somebody who's coming in and asking for help getting food stamps is also reporting that they don't sleep well because, they have a lot of nightmares. And, then you can start to think, okay, well, maybe this is someone who needs some trauma referrals as well for some trauma treatment. So anyway, I digress there. But so question number 1 in the discussion questions for seminar 2 is going to ask you to think about your thinking about PTSD victims and trauma in general, and has that shifted at all with the introductory items that we've read and talked about in the videos you watched last week. So I just really want you to push yourself to process what you're learning. So for the seminar 1 discussion questions, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I read in your responses. Several of you haven't responded, so I really want you guys to make sure that you respond. So question number 1, the issue about PTSD not being added to the DSM until 1980 and the current challenges for vets with PTSD. You guys did a great job of pointing out that World War I and World War II vets would have been left out. a huge notable population, though, would have been Vietnam War vets. A lot of us know that, many Vietnam War vets really suffered and struggled with PTSD and trauma and the results of that trauma. In terms of the role of political and societal perceptions, World War II certainly would have been any war is incredibly, incredibly traumatic. I think that it's definitely compounded by the fact that by how they're received when they come home. So I want you to think about the difference between, in World War II, and I think I mentioned this in my Seminar 1 video, that after World War I, a lot of those guys were able to come back heroes, and it was sort of a non-controversial war, whereas Vietnam was very controversial. And so a lot of these guys were coming home after suffering this incredible trauma. They were coming home to being attacked or being very much judged for their role in this controversial war. I would say that today we have some of that similar issues there. There's a lot of controversy about the war in Iraq, and I think although by and large most of us have made it clear, hey, I may or may not agree or disagree with the war, but I always support our vets. I know that's still difficult for them to hear that anybody doesn't support the war. A lot of them don't support the wars. I know that, that was an issue for my brother was, the war in Iraq was started under somewhat controversial and questionable circumstances, and that was difficult for him to deal with. And so I think that's definitely something to think about. The other thing in terms of current challenges for vets with PTSD, you guys, hit the nail on the head. The resources are just not there. I think it was Shelby's response that said that, or one of you guys wrote that, you heard from an actual vet who said the VA doesn't do anything. The VA is making changes, and they're really trying to step up the services they provide. But at the end of the day, it's a huge entity, and they have struggled to figure out how to manage the amount of vets that are coming back that need services. I think the other thing that's definitely a challenge for vets with PTSD is, dealing with the questions they get asked. I know a major question that you should never ask a vet and should never is, have you killed someone, right? So you can't really assume that someone has or hasn't in war, and that's a very, very touchy question. I'm surprised with my brother how many people have asked him that, and he refuses to answer that. I think we all know the answer, but it's a very difficult. That's a basic question, but unless somebody brings that up, I wouldn't even go there. So that's part of that issue with how they're treated when they get back. Question 2, the similarities and differences between traumatic experiences of rape victims and soldiers of war. So some things to think about was the role of victim blaming for rape victims versus the hero concept of the combat soldier. So, in the United States, especially, when women are raped or sexually assaulted, there is often an assessment of what their role in that process was, right? So, what were they wearing, and were they drinking? Did they lead the guy on? All of those things. So there's a lot of things that lead to a lot of victim blaming, not only by society of rape victims, but the rape victims themselves do this to themselves. This is part of their process, where they will question, should I have worn that? Should I have been there? Should I, what could I have done different? And so, and that's an additional part of that trauma. Soldiers, on the other hand, often come back. Sorry, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee here. Remember, this is supposed to mirror a real class. So in class, I would take a sip of water, but it's 4:00 in the morning. So soldiers often come back with this hero concept, right? That every soldier is a hero. In speaking to my brother and reading a lot of the articles and the research, that's also a struggle too, because trauma in and of itself really leads people to question their role in whatever the incident is, in every aspect. So am I really a hero? I have this trauma. I have these flashbacks and I've killed people possibly, or I've hurt people, and yet I'm being hailed as a hero. And that doesn't, for them, a lot of the times that doesn't match well with how they feel about themselves. And that's really difficult too. So these are just some things to think about. And, the idea of a soldier being seen as a hero and being revered as a hero doesn't necessarily make the trauma easier in and of itself. Probably not. It certainly doesn't seem so. So the other challenge is the challenge of sharing experiences in each context. Rape victims will struggle to tell their rape story. It's very uncomfortable to talk about being groped or being, having somebody rape you. That's a very, very uncomfortable thing to discuss. It's also very uncomfortable to discuss your role in war. It's difficult to talk about killing someone or watching somebody be killed or, those things. So, those are just things to think about because it can be difficult to have your clients share their struggles with these issues. So in terms of unpacking the reading assignments, I wanted to talk, I don't want to just assign reading and then assume that you guys get out of it what I want you to. So in the first article, The Lifelong Consequences of Rape, it was interesting that, obviously I created this course, last semester. So, and I had that class read this, and currently things are very, very relevant, right? So right now, the discussion of rape and sexual assault is very in the news with allegations of sexual abuse but against, we've had it certainly against Harvey Weinstein, who was the big Hollywood producer, but against tons of actors and then people in the media and politics. So this is a very, very relevant topic. And it's important to think about how current events, times like this, where you have just tons of people talking about rape and sexual assault. So something to keep in mind is these types of eras and these events can really trigger our clients. So when you have a client who's been doing really well, following through on their treatment plan and dealing with their trauma really well, and suddenly every time they turn on the TV, all that anybody's talking about is rape and sexual assault, and not in the best ways either. There's some very unhealthy discussions about these topics that are going on Facebook and on TV. This can be really difficult for our clients. So we really want to be aware of that. So if you have a client that you're working with, and that out in the world, these things are occurring, when they show up for their session or, show up for their appointment with you or you meet with them, saying, hey, how are you doing with everything that's going on? Do you feel any triggers? Are you triggered by this at all? We're going to talk about triggers a little bit more, but it's definitely something you don't want to ignore. You want to make sure that you talk about how these things can trigger them and how they're going to handle those things. So one of the things that was interesting about the article is it talks about just the long-standing consequences of rape, right? So the article refers to women who were raped during World War II while they were in their 20s, being interviewed later in their 80s, and they were still incredibly affected by the event. And that's relevant right now because a lot of the allegations that are coming out right now are from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And people are saying, oh, that was 30 years ago. How can we be discussing this now? There's certainly, questions about, the time and those sorts of things. But I think that it's important to understand, and I am not assuming that anyone in the media now or any allegations, I'm not taking a position as to whether or not anything's true or untrue. I'm not even going to go there. But I think that the idea that time has passed and therefore it should not be a big deal, this article and the research that has been conducted simply does not bear that out, right? So women who have been raped or sexually assaulted continue to be affected by those events for many, many years after, especially if they were never treated for that trauma, if they were never able to process that. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you're hearing people say something like, well, she was raped 10 years ago. Why are we just hearing about this now? Why is she barely able to talk about it now? Well, maybe because she's been processing it for 10 years. So, and then I want you to think about the physical effects of rape. That's something that's discussed in the article. Sexual dysfunction, which is a big deal, right? Because somebody who's raped and then goes on to try to have a healthy sexual relationship is going to struggle with doing so, right? And that's part of that healing process, is being able to go on and feel normal. Well, if every time you try to have a normal relationship, these issues are coming up, that's sort of a re-traumatization, and that's really difficult. And it's something that we need to think about with our victims of rape. One of the things that the article mentioned was the fact that studies have shown that rape victims have permanently elevated cortisol levels, right? So cortisol is that hormone in your body that raises during sort of, we have that alert in us, right? So when we see a bear in the woods, right, our cortisol levels shoot up and we know that we need to run. Well, when you've been raped or been through some major trauma, often your cortisol levels are permanently up because you have that constant anxiety. You're in that constant fear. You've never been able to sort of get to a place of calm. And so having permanently elevated cortisol levels has long-term health effects, including permanent effects on the brain. That's one of the things that the research points out. So it's really important to know that, trauma not only affects folks, mentally and emotionally, but physically, it's a really big deal as well. So one of the really important questions posed in the article is, why are the effects of rape so significant and potentially chronic? And I wanted to underline and bold that word chronic, because chronic issues are really difficult for people. Think about chronic means constant, daily, something that is constantly needing to be dealt with. And I want you to think about that. If you have an issue or a chronic illness, a chronic trauma, something you simply cannot get rid of, seemingly, right? You can't seem to get there. That is so hard. That's just incredibly difficult for our clients. So, the answer to that question of why are the effects of rape so significant and potentially chronic, the answer that was provided in the article, one of the things they said is that it involves both the brain chemistry and society's treatment of its victims. So it's really difficult to help clients, especially those who've had really severe trauma, overcome that, because not only has it changed their brain chemistry, but we're trying to help them navigate a society that does not know how to deal with trauma victims appropriately. And that's really hard. And so that's why it's really important for us to be aware of these issues, not only so that we can provide appropriate treatment to trauma victims, but so that we can so that we can educate those around us about trauma and how to deal with this appropriately. Now I will say, as I said earlier, I don't, with everything going on now in Hollywood and, on Facebook and everything about all these sexual allegations, I really try to stay away from assuming that anybody is correct or incorrect, or the allegations are true or untrue. I try, these are not situations that that I'm going to weigh in on necessarily, because I think there's a big challenge, and that's that we have to balance the respect of victims and the rights of the accused. And that's really difficult, because I think one of the things that's hard about rape and sexual assault is that often, and not just sexual assault, but sexual harassment, molestation, these are all things that very often women, not just women, but women, men, children, don't report for, a long time because of shame and just the trauma and all of those, all of the issues that come with that. So when they do report, there's often not evidence. And I think it's important to understand that there are times in which folks are accused of rape or sexual harassment in which the allegations are found to be false. And that's really difficult. It's really, I remember being a manager and being told by a child, a female teenage girl, that one of a male staff member that worked for me had done something inappropriate. And luckily she was, she told us the day and the time it reportedly happened, and it was in a place where, unbeknownst to her, we had cameras. And so I was able to take what she said, and she gave me a very teary sort of disclosure. But when I pulled up the cameras and pulled it up, nothing that she said happened actually occurred. And when I was, and I'll never forget, I had to, by policy, bring this young man in while we were getting camera footage, and he had to be put on very, very temporary suspension. It was like a day, because I needed time to look into this. But I remember he was so, and this is a grown man, he was so offended and hurt by this allegation that I remember watching him cry in my office. And it was really difficult to watch. I liked this guy. In that moment, I had no idea if what I was hearing that occurred was true or not. But when we watched the camera footage and they confronted this young lady with this information and showed her the camera footage, she then admitted that none of the things that she had told me were true, and that essentially she had a crush on him, and he told her, that's inappropriate, and basically put her in her place. And she was very upset by it. Now, do I think that's common? Do I think that a lot of people lie about rape or sexual assault? No, I don't. I don't. Do I think it happens? I absolutely do. And so I think that some people do lie about that. So, and there are some notable stories of that. So that's, I think the big thing that I would say is that we all need to be very careful in how we respond. We have to be very thoughtful, and don't immediately jump into the fray. Don't immediately jump on one side or the other. I think sort of sitting back a little bit and always ensuring that we remain, and that doesn't mean that you stay out of it and that you don't advocate, but I think that you can advocate in a way that does, in general, for trauma victims and for rape victims, without necessarily weighing in on the specifics of a certain case. So that would be, what my thoughts are there. For your other reading article, 10 Years and a Diagnosis Later, the 9/11 Demons Haunt Thousands, the New York Times article. I think that article I really liked because it pointed out the importance of understanding secondary trauma, right? So secondary trauma is trauma experienced after listening or observing to the firsthand trauma of others, right? So that's a little bit different than what we hear a lot in our industry, which is vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is very common among social workers and other helping professions. And it results from empathetic engagement with traumatized clients. Essentially, you're working with people who are traumatized so often that their trauma and your empathy sort of their trauma becomes your trauma, just because you've worked with them so much. Secondary trauma is where you've heard about trauma from someone who experienced it firsthand, or you've witnessed it, and it affects you as if though you experienced it yourself, right? And so one of the things so the story talked a lot about, the main person and the doctor in the story that was being followed, she talked about suffering from trauma for years after 9/11 from watching it from her apartment, right? Watching people fall from this building, and how traumatizing that is, and that was, and I can only imagine. One of the things that I thought was interesting was there was a line that said that 9/11 ripped at the most ordinary fabric of daily life, and that to me got to the heart of what's so hard about trauma is that when something occurs, whether it's 9/11 or something else, that shakes your sense of security in your world and in your life, that is really difficult to overcome. And so I think that got to the heart of what trauma essentially does, is it makes you question your own security and the what you thought you knew. You thought your father was a loving and wonderful man, and then one day he rapes you. that is incredibly, or, you know, you thought your father was a wonderful man who would always be around to take care of you, and one day he dies suddenly. You know, these are things that shake what your core beliefs were, and that's what's so hard to overcome. Another line from the article that I thought was really interesting was when one of the Charles Figley in the article says, you go into a combat zone and then you leave. You don't leave home, you return all the time. So that's one of the issues with overcoming trauma also, is the fact, you know, one of the differences between sort of non-war trauma and war trauma is that, you know, when you suffer trauma in your home and that's where you live, is hard, the environment is hard to get away from, and that certainly contributes to that trauma. And so that's something we want to think about when we're working with folks, is how trauma, how are they being re-traumatized every single day just from the fact that they can't leave the physical environment in which the original trauma occurred. So something to think about. The other a major issue that came up was the concerns regarding payment for therapy related to secondary trauma. So they discussed the fact that, you know, thousands of people in New York would have experienced secondary trauma on that day. And it's really difficult to figure out how to allocate funds for that, because the easiest folks to treat, or to say, okay, these funds for 9/11 therapy go to the people who were in the building or have family that were in the building, period. Well, what about the thousands of people who watched people jump to their death? You know, that's incredibly, it's hard to figure out how to, you know, allocate funds. And that's something we as social workers do have to think about. We have to think about how the services that we want for our clients are being funded. And that, you know, so I really wanted you to sort of see how money and allocation of funds for resources is also always a very important topic in our field. So something to think about there. So we're continuing to talk about cognitive processing therapy versus exposure therapy. And one of the reasons why I think it's important for you guys to understand different types of therapy is, again, a lot of you guys as BSWs are going to be in referral positions where you're referring folks to different services. And then many of you are going to go on to getting your master's and becoming clinicians. So you want to understand these therapies. So it's important to know what therapies are out there for your clients. So cognitive processing therapy falls under the cognitive behavioral therapy umbrella, right? So I know that you've talked about, or many of you have probably learned about cognitive behavioral therapy in your other classes. If you haven't, sorry, you know, it's definitely something that you'll probably, you know, you hear about CBT all the time, cognitive behavioral therapy. A big thing to understand about cognitive behavioral therapy and how cognitive processing therapy relates is cognitive behavioral therapy aims to confront maladaptive thoughts and beliefs that lead to unwanted behavior, right? So, you know, I have grown up, you know, if, for example, if a woman says, I've grown up with a mother who, you know, was very, you know, neglected me and was very abusive, and therefore I believe that I'm worthless. And so I am now, you know, I self-medicate, you know, my depression through alcoholism, right? So you can see where there was an incident, or there was a, you know, a situation in her life. It led to a maladaptive thought or belief, right? She now believes she's worthless, and it's leading to unwanted behaviors and symptoms. So depression and alcohol use, right? So cognitive processing therapy is very similar. It aims to challenge maladaptive thoughts and beliefs, but about causes or consequences of a specific traumatic event, right? So an event happens, a woman is raped, and there's often maladaptive thoughts and beliefs that come regarding that. So whether it's, I should have, you know, this happened because I was dressed a certain way, or because I allowed myself to be near a man. And so that may also lead to, the world is an unsafe place, I can't leave my home. You know, there's all of these maladaptive thoughts and beliefs that come as a result of this consequence of this traumatic event. And so cognitive processing therapy aims to confront those maladaptive thoughts and beliefs. Prolonged exposure therapy for trauma PTSD. So traditional exposure therapy was for anxiety disorders, right? And it was intended to force clients to directly confront their source of anxiety. If you're, afraid of heights, we're going to take you to the top of a ladder, and then we're going to take you to the top of a roof, and all that. And the idea was that continuing to expose yourself in a safe environment to what you were afraid of would desensitize you to that, right? So prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD is aimed at confronting avoidance strategies for PTSD sufferers. So most people with PTSD or a history of trauma, the way in which they deal with that is they don't, right? So many of them decide, I'm not even going to think about it. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to pretend it never happened. The problem is it did happen, right? So they continue to have these maladaptive behaviors and thoughts, but they're not connecting those two things, right? So the idea is for them to confront their source of anxiety by sharing their trauma story, which they've been trying for years to not tell. So now we're asking them to tell their story over and over again and discussing it directly so that, again, they can sort of desensitize to it or process it, right? It's often combined with eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which is EMDR, which is fascinating. And we will be discussing EMDR more at the Alan Ground seminar on December 16th. I'll have a guest speaker who's an EMDR guru. So I'm really excited about that. So, to continue sort of learning about CBT and exposure therapy, I have these two different videos that I want you to watch. A Dateline story. This Dateline story is so old, but I like it. I think it's really relevant, and it's a great example of exposure therapy used to process trauma. The cognitive processing therapy video is super short. It's like 2 minutes, but I thought it would it sort of give you a rundown of cognitive processing therapy. I have that class discussion, but I just realized that I changed my discussion questions, so don't even worry about those discussions. We can discuss that in person when we meet on 12/16. So seminar two, for the next sort of chunk of information, the foundation of the entire next part of the next seminar is the integrative ACT intervention model, right? So there's a journal article that I have posted called Assessment, Crisis Intervention, and Trauma Treatment, the Integrative ACT Intervention Model by Dr. Robert Alberts. I want you all to read it. It's 22 pages, but I think it's a great read. It's very interesting. I found it fascinating. Maybe it's because I'm a nerd, but who knows? I thought it was really interesting. It discusses the different types of childhood trauma and the differences between, he differentiates between children who have sort of one single traumatic event and those who have constant and multiple traumatic events. And it presents a 3-step intervention model for responding to clients in crisis. So read the article and answer discussion question number 2 regarding the information presented, and then we'll discuss the article further in seminar number 3. One of the things it brings up is the importance of assessment, and so I thought that I would sort of do a really quick refresher on the biopsychosocial assessment. I think you guys have heard about the biopsychosocial assessment about 1 million times at this point, which means that you'll all be pros at it by the time you graduate. So a few things to think about. What do you know? So think about what you already know about biopsychosocial assessments, what you need to identify. What should you try to rule out? A big thing there is you want to be able to rule out medical issues so before you start, going down the road of simply treating someone as a therapeutic client, if they're, for example, if they're confused. So the example I always give is an elderly person with a urinary tract infection often presents incredibly confused, and people think, oh, they've suddenly got dementia. Well, they may have dementia, but they may not. It may be an infection. And so we need to, if you have an infection in your body, it often leads you to be very confused. So you want to rule some of those things out. Um, so the article discusses assessment a lot and the ways in which you need to be asking questions. I just wanted to sort of remind you all that of the biopsychosocial assessment and that combination of really assessing what somebody's psychological status is, their social status, and their biological status, right? So that comes together to be your biopsychosocial assessment. And always when it comes to assessment, think about how you phrase questions in a way that best allows you to identify the presenting issues. So which questions and actions would you avoid? So the big things that you want to avoid are the why questions. So you're working with a domestic violence. Well, why didn't you, victim, a domestic violence victim, why didn't you leave? Why did you do this? Because sometimes, you want to be very careful with your why questions, because why questions can often make people feel judged. So, a better, if somebody made a decision and you want to say, well, why did you do that? A better way to ask that would be to, okay, so my understanding is you did X. Can you tell me about your process for deciding to do that? So that, is a way, instead of saying, well, why did you do that? Which immediately sounds like, well, was I not supposed to? Saying, can you tell me about your process for deciding to do that? Tells them more that you're interested in understanding that process, right? So which questions are uncomfortable but should be asked? So it depends on the setting, right? But you want to be able to ask someone, about, about their substance abuse issues, how often, what are they using? How often, when was the last time they used? Those things all come, and your ability to ask uncomfortable questions all come out of your ability to develop rapport. That is absolutely, if you have not developed a rapport with someone, you can't then turn around and ask them, so, do you use drugs? So that's really important. And we're going to discuss those questions more on that on-ground seminar. Those are a lot of the things that we're going to be discussing. I really want you guys to be able to, and I've said this over and over again in many of my classes, that it's incredibly important for you as social workers to develop the skill to connect with people very quickly and assess very quickly, because most of your positions will be such that you need to be able to meet someone, develop rapport, and assess them all in, half hour, an hour, sometimes 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, it's very, very short. So learning to connect with people is really important in our industry. So again, rapport is so incredibly important. So one of the things that I wanted to discuss in this seminar was how your physical setting, your office setting, setup, or how you're sitting, or the physical elements of meeting with people, how that can impact treatment, right? So I've posted this article for you guys to look at. It's short and quick and gives you some things to think about. Workplace as a sacred space. It's a really great article, and it's something to think about, and it's something we often don't think about, right? Because I know that for my program, we never discussed this at all when I was in school. It was all about what you asked and what you did with clients when they were with you, right? And I thought this is an interesting thing to kind of go a step further and really look around at your physical environment. So read the article and answer discussion question 3. It's important. Some things I just wanted to remind you all is to remember your role and in your scope of practice, right? So you will conduct trauma work in various settings, but remember that although we want you to understand and be knowledgeable of different diagnoses, you are not a diagnoser. So unless you are an LCSW, so you want to always understand your scope of practice, and the fact that you may be conducting trauma work in various settings. So, when it comes to physical settings, you want to be able to sort of figure out how you can sort of shift your setting on the fly, maybe, and how you can set things up so that you can provide really good services for someone depending on what your setting is. And remember that our goal is always to avoid re-victimization. That in whatever your role is, whatever your setting is, always remember that you want to identify symptoms without forcing clients to retell their story right off the bat, especially if you're doing an intake. You want to know what's appropriate for your position and for your role, because the two things, I always say that working as a social worker, your goal should always be to empower your clients. Well, when you're working with trauma victims, a major goal should always be to avoid re-victimization. So obviously retelling the story may be part of the therapeutic process, and that's a whole other ballgame, but just wanted to make sure that we discuss that. So another thing that I really want you guys to start thinking about is the idea of triggers, right? So there's a triggers fact sheet on domestic violence. And there's the discussion of trigger eradication versus trigger management, right? So when should a trigger be completely avoided and when should it be managed, right? So there are times in which triggers should be completely avoided and taken out, right? So somebody who says, every time I spend time with Jimmy down the street, he's a huge trigger for me to shoot up heroin. Well, maybe we need to just talk about cutting Jimmy from down the street out of your life completely, right? So let's take that trigger and let's take that completely out. Every time I watch X TV show, it triggers me to feel this incredible anxiety. Well, how about we talk about just not watching that anymore? Now, there's other times where there's trigger management, right? So I've had people, clients who've really talked about for example, I remember a woman talking about her mother. Her mother triggered her. Her mother would say things and do things that immediately triggered incredible anxiety in her, and depression. And so that's where we would talk about how she could manage. She couldn't cut her mother out of her life. She lived with her mother. But we talked about how she could manage that situation so that she could manage her triggers. So those are things that I want you to think about. There are times when triggers can lead to a positive reaction that develops appropriate coping skills, right? So if we can train someone who says, every time I, drive down X street where a trauma happened, I feel this immense anxiety. And we train them that, okay, when you go drive down the street and you start to feel that anxiety, I want you to relive. We talk about some positive event. Let's relive that. And, and maybe that leads them to not only drive down the street without that anxiety, but they're able to drive down the street feeling happy about this other event that they've been able to think about. That's just a minor example, but that should be the goal of triggers, right? So a trigger should either be managed or it should be shifted to provide a positive reaction so that clients are able to develop appropriate coping skills. So for our next seminar, in Seminar 3, we'll be discussing triggers in individual settings versus group settings a little bit more, because that's really important. So we're going to be talking about basic treatment planning a lot on that on-ground seminar on December 16th. One thing I did want to talk about, though, was developing goals with clients, right? So it's really important that we always have goals with clients. I need to move this out of the way a little bit. So sometimes they may need help with figuring out what their goals might be. You might need to extrapolate information from them. So they may be telling this long story about what's going on with them, and you need to be able to say, okay, well, it sounds like you're really struggling with your diet. It sounds like you're talking about you have all this anxiety and it leads you to binge. So sometimes sometimes you have to sort of extrapolate. You have to be able to listen to their big story and extrapolate what sounds like might be the issues and the important items and the goals The big thing about goals is always allowing yourself to start where the client is and let them lead the conversation on goals, and only assist if necessary. So if you ask them what their goals are, and they, you know, they might tell you this story where you're thinking, okay, your goals should be this, this, and this. But when you ask them, so what are your goals for treatment? What would you like to do? And they give you something completely different than what you were thinking, that's okay. You need to start where they are. So a big example I always give is when you're working in a domestic violence shelter, and you know somebody has a drug issue and you desperately want to help them with the drug issue, but they don't. They just want help with the domestic violence. Well, you have to go where they are. You may go there eventually, but you have to start where they are. So a big way to get people to, sometimes you have folks that don't know what their goals are and sort of can't even imagine what they can do to better their lives. Asking the miracle question is always helpful. We've talked about this in a lot of classes. The idea of asking someone, if you woke up tomorrow and all your problems were solved, what would your life look like, right? That's a great question to ask. Long-term goals versus short-term goals, right? So, you know, an example would be, a long-term goal would be to live independently and support myself. So a short-term goal would be to walk around my neighborhood without being overcome with anxiety and going home. So that's for somebody who has, you know, maybe has such extreme anxiety that they don't leave their home, right? So you want to make sure that you have short-term versus long-term goals. They should be measurable and attainable, right? So the example, living independently versus never feeling anxiety again. Can we really work with a client who is never going to feel anxiety again? No, that's not realistic. But we can work together to talk about managing anxiety to a point that you can live independently. That's totally realistic. So discussing realistic expectations is really, really important. I'm sorry I'm starting to run through this, but I'm realizing that I've made you guys the longest video ever, so I don't want, you know, this to take forever. But so for the next seminar, I want you guys to start learning about mental health services that are Arizona specific. We have some controversy in our state, which is at the root of our mental health services. I want you to watch, and they're rooted in this case called Arnold v. Sarn. I want you to watch these two videos so that you learn a little bit more about the cases and start thinking about how you can see how these cases played out in our state based on what you know. And then start thinking about your community organization's presentation. It's not due until December 16th, but I want to sort of give you guys assignments little by little so that you are prepared on that day. So you'll be assigned a client population on the next slide. I want you to research an organization in Arizona that provides services to that client population. Provide general information on the organization. So you're going to present and tell us what type of client they serve. I want you to create a one-page flyer of the organization that includes location, contact information, referral procedure. That's really important. So you might have an agency that, for example, the Mark Center. I can't just send someone to the Mark Center to get services. They have to be enrolled with the REBA in Maricopa County, you know, for mental health services, who then gets them into the Mark Center, right? So I want to know, what's the referral procedure? Do they have to be a certain kind of, do they have to be at a certain level of, you know, income to qualify? You know, really give us the meat of it, because the idea is that these flyers will be shared with your fellow students so that you guys can all continue growing your referral network. It's so important for you guys to know what services are out there so that you can provide great referrals to your clients. So these are the assigned populations: pregnant mothers and teens. Nancy, you're going to do yours on that. LGBTQ youth, Jalissa. Homeless clients, Jennifer. Rape victims, Shelby. Teen runaways, Allison. And refugees, Desiree. So if you have any questions, please shoot me an email or a text. I'm sorry this video was so long, but I hope that you guys are learning. This is my first real online class that I'm teaching for CSS with video, so I'm a little bit lacking confidence in this. So please let me know what your thoughts are, if you have feedback or issues, or if you're struggling to follow me. I have a kind of an erratic presentation style sometimes too. So, but thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know if you have questions. Thanks. Bye.